Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you having important conversations on history and heritage, which I know has such great value to so many of you. Can I start tonight by first acknowledging any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander guests that we have today, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The History Trust of South Australia respects the primary place of Aboriginal people in our history. We acknowledge that this story commenced long before Governor Hindmarsh proclaimed the establishment of government in the province of South Australia on the 28th of December 1836. But can I also welcome everyone here tonight for this Postcards from the Edge celebration and conversation. As I said, a really important conversation to be had, and I think no one would have escaped the reference to Postcards from the Edge, because this is a little bit of an event tonight to recognise the work, the passion, the excitement, the awareness creation that Keith Conlon has brought to so many things. He is now, of course, a retired veteran of radio and TV current affairs and magazine programs here in Adelaide. And with a well-recognised passion for our state, it's pretty hard to match the passion that Keith brings to just about anything. I saw him walk in with a glass of red tonight and I thought, oh, he's fired up already. So be prepared for what might come. He has earned the nickname Mr. South Australia during his time as host and reporter on the national award-winning show Postcards on Channel 9 at the time. During his radio eras, and this is probably where I've known him most, he's highlighted a wide range of community issues, both in his role as a presenter, but also in his role as chair of the Heritage Trust, in which I think we can all agree he has advocated very strongly for heritage right along the way. And of course, with his roles working on the Sandful Football History Committee, he also continues to support several community organisations, and alongside that too, he also still enjoys playing his jazz, which you may well have enjoyed listening to at various times, presenting fringe shows on the funniest side of Adelaide's past, including Keith Conlon's Horrible Histories of Adelaide, and also in his role as a photographer. He has done so many things, there is no doubt about it. So we're looking forward to welcoming Keith Conlon tonight. But if he is equally matched, I should say, in his passion and enthusiasm for all things history and heritage in his interlocutor tonight, in Dr. Kiera Lindsey. She is the History Trust of South Australia's inaugural South Australian history advocate. And for those of us who love history and heritage, I think it's a role that many of us are glad is being taken up, and particularly by someone who can communicate history in such an enthusiastic, relevant, wonderful, contemporary way. And that is certainly Kiera's strengths. Now, she undertakes research, advocacy and outreach to historical organisations, individual practitioners and the broader community in her role, while also connecting with urban and regional communities and other groups to increase the appreciation of our distinctive history. She's also an award-winning historian herself who's been enthusiastically and imaginatively exploring historical ideas and stimulating our passion for the past through her books, through her articles, radio, podcasts, film and television, and teaching and talking for over 20 years. Tonight, it's all going to be about history and heritage. You will get the chance to ask your questions, make your comments, and I encourage you to do so. Let's keep it as civilised as we can, because I know that passion often ignites people's passions in that way, but let's do it as civilised as we can. But good luck too, because I don't know how you're going to get a word in with these two. Please welcome Keith Conlon and Dr. Kiera Lindsey.
G'day everybody. Hey, thanks for being here. So good to see everybody.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been nobbled. I thought this was sort of a joint idea to start with, and I thought I was here to celebrate and give you the chance to celebrate the appointment of and the early big runs that she's getting on the board, the new history advocate, Kiera Lindsey. Hey!
Well, you can't do that. You're not going to get away with that one. Now, what we want to do tonight is we're going to talk about three different issues or three different ideas, and Keith and I are going to have a bit of a chin wag on each one for about 10 minutes, maybe about 9. Let's see how we go. And then we're going to open it up to you, and we're going to invite you to contribute. Our starting point is to celebrate Keith's incredible contribution to South Australian history and heritage. His huge and happy heart. You know, I just see whenever someone sees Keith, their eyes light up and they start chewing off his ear. Until that is, he starts chewing off their ears.
Yes.
So that's where we're going to start our conversation. We're going to talk a little bit about why history matters and also how we can give history the best possible future. And it's up to all of us to do that. We want to hear your concerns, the things that excite you, and your suggestions. So, but let's start with you, Keith. Let's talk a little bit about who are you? And why you love history so much.
That's a hard question, I'm sure. I mean, you're all here because you love history, and it's sometimes a bit hard to kind of narrow it down. But I am the very happy son of my mum and dad, Alf and Maureen, and they had very little formal education. But they just loved our stories. My dad was in the 30s, not much work around, was working in gardens at Blackwood, where we lived. My mum had worked on a mallee farm for a while. Imagine as a 15-year-old, she's out getting the horses up in the dark and getting the bridles on and ready to go out. There's still horse and plough days. And there are a couple of stories I remember well. She said, she didn't really like the cream making a lot because that was another job, of course, you had to do it on the mallee farm. But the one that really worried us when she moved down to Coromandel Valley, she was working as a maid in one of the big houses, and the water tank, you had to go into the middle of the water tank to pump it and get the water out. And it's a little bit like she never got on a plane because she thought the bottom would fall out. Well, she thought the top was going to fall in. But they grew up in that sort of humble fashion, but really enjoyed life. And I reckon, I say only half jokingly, I reckon the history bug came from being in the back of the Morris 840 with my brother and all the camping gear on the top and heading for Mount Gambier and Port Lincoln and every point in between. And whenever there was a signpost that said museum or monument or lookout, we went there. And so there was just this sort of natural sense of wow about all the stuff we've got. And I'm sure you've said it yourself, that sort of, it's a very typical saying as you go past one of those lovely old farmhouses, wow, if those walls could talk. And that was a sort of a favourite idea. So I think that's where it sort of started to go. And then you need a bit of luck to head in that direction. And I scored a scholarship to St Peter's, where, to my amazement, I was in the same class as people whose names were on streets and towns and rather large things, like we're on Morford Street. Well, there was one of the Morfords in there. And so I'm thinking, oh, these are the people who this is the other half that you maybe, just go quietly about their riches. But in fact, it also led you into the fact that, the Bagot was, it's the same Bagot as Captain Bagot at the Kapunda Mine, or it's John Morford. Who hasn't been to Cummins House? You haven't been to Cummins House? Oh, that's good. Thank God for that. That's a very poor percentage because Cummins is one of our lovely state heritage places, and that's where Elizabeth and John Morford, founding member of the push for South Australia, that's where they lived on the Sturt River, and it's still there, tucked away in Nova Gardens these days. Nova Gardens is the farm, basically. But Elizabeth Morford headed off in, I think it was the late 1840s, with the kids to London for a year to buy the furniture, because they were just expanding the place. And so we've only...
you do.
Yeah, exactly. We didn't need somehow our extension didn't need a trip to London for a year, but one of the nice things about working on the Heritage Council in the last 5 years has been that the collection of furniture, including a grand piano that was given by Elizabeth's dad, who happened to be, is Louise in the house? Louise Bird? but Dave might remember this. Dave Hanna's exec officer of the Heritage Council and had the misfortune of working with me closely for 5 years. The grand piano was a gift of her father. That was James Hurtle Fisher, wasn't it? Dave, just nod approvingly. That'll do. Yeah.
Or heckle.
Yeah. And so you've got to go. That's an aside, but you've got to go and see Cummins, and they do run a lovely afternoon tea on the third Sunday of each month, I think it is. So a lovely example of history that's sitting there as a house museum. So I don't know how the hell I got to Cummins, but basically...
come back onto the topic,
luckily,
Keith.
I got to uni.
This is my job.
I eventually got to uni with a real dose of history, with a couple of fantastic... Who's had a great history teacher in their life? Yes, exactly. It's very often, it's one of the turning points, isn't it? And then I managed to, major in history and somehow scrape through law, but spent a lot of my time doing things in the Union Hall. In fact, people like Michael Jacobs and I, we actually majored in Union Hall. And in fact, I think we both got a credit, come to think of it. But that was where the kind of communication side came in. We didn't have things like communications degrees or media degrees. So we got it by doing silly comedy sketches and so on. And somehow the two came together, history and politics and a bit of law, and then particularly sort of current affairs on radio.
Yeah.
I got my job actually on television. I ended up on television because of history. And I only twigged to that today again. I thought, oh yeah. In the early 80s, there was a show that some of you might remember. Colin Tearley, the great Colin Tearley, wrote it. It was called The Adelaide Story. It was a 90-minute sort of doco that was put together by Channel 7. And I happened to be at the uni gym one day, and a mate from radio days was there, and I said, what are you up to? And he said, I'm working on this terrific project. It's called The Adelaide Story, Colin Tearley, all that. And I said, oh, well, I hope you're going to put in the bit about how that money from the mines and the money from wool came into town. It's right here on North Terrace. He said, oh, okay. And a fortnight later, he said, you want to do that bit? So I ended up walking around pointing at people like Elder and Walter Watson Hughes and telling the story of how the workers and the riches of South Australia in that boom period of the 19th century literally shaped Adelaide physically, shaped our institutions and our statues and so on. So I ended up doing that on and off for decades to come. So that's how I ended up here.
Wow. I mean, there's so much in that story, isn't there? There's the parents who instill that love of storytelling while you're driving along at the bedside, while you're sitting, going to bed at night. And then the school teachers, the good and the bad. I had awful school history teachers. I hated history at school, in fact. I was much more down the literary side of the spectrum. I loved poetry and literature, especially Australian stuff. And so it was Chris Wallace-Crabbe. I don't know if many of you know him. The wonderful poet.
Right, yeah.
He taught
We're not going to try and one-up that, are we?
Yeah. He taught me at university, and I had to do this course in my third or fourth year on colonial history. And, the excitement of the Georgian era, to think that all those crazy kind of personalities and characters were here. And so that's something that just completely captured my imagination.
I've got a story for you about that passion for history. History 1 at university, 1963. We've got some really boring bloke talking about medieval ecclesiastical history. I mean, what were they trying to do? Put us off forever. But halfway through the year, the Georgians appeared because a fellow called Trevor Wilson, many of you will remember the great Trevor Wilson, the late great Professor Trevor Wilson, who actually is known internationally as a war historian, but he suddenly switched into the second half of that year, and I reckon it was the first lecture that this quaint little English chap started talking about George III.
Yep.
And how George III at one stage got out of his carriage in Hyde Park and shook hands with a tree. I was in.
I mean, Keith and I, we both love, and I guess most people here do too, people behaving badly in history. and it kind of gives you a license to do badly behaved history too, right?
It's a great idea.
Yeah.
In fact, that's next year's topic.
Yeah, I mean, but I guess what I'm trying to say there is that your history, the way that you've done history, has always been full of lots of fun, rollicking yarns, music, horrible histories.
We got a shocker today.
Yeah.
Today is the anniversary. I think it is, isn't it, Sonia? Today's the day? Yep, today's the day when we had our first public hanging in South Australia. About 500 people rock off down into the North Parklands near where the weir is today. It was Michael McGee, was an unfortunate who claimed he wasn't an escapee from over there, but he was. And he made a very bad career move. He shot the sheriff. He actually missed him, but he tried to shoot the sheriff when he was trying to raid his tent. And he got pinged, and then we were going to execute him, public hanging, of course. But we didn't have an executioner because South Australia was so pure. We didn't have a police force, and we didn't have an executioner. So they had to get the cook from the South.
So much for good planning.
They got the cook from the South Australian company. It was a bloody awful executioner.
Wow.
He organised a horse and cart under a big gum tree. He's got that over the top there. All right, there you go. Gives the horse a bit of a pat. The horse just sort of walks away. And so McGee grabs the rope, and there he is hanging there screaming blue murder. Wow. What are we going to do? The cook ticks off into the scrub. Come back, they say, oi, oi, murder. And it was, of course. And so, only legal murder. And so the cook comes back, and they say, well, get on with it. So what does he do? He runs at him with a rugby tackle and grabs him around the knees and he yanks him until he carks it.
Oh.
So that's today's story.
Definitely a horrible history.
Exactly. We may get back to the macabre later.
Well, let's hear from you. Can we? What we'd love you to do is turn to the person on your left and introduce yourself and tell them a little bit about who bit the bug, who helped you fall in love with history, and what it is you really love about history. So just a bit of a chat, and then we want to hear from you. We want to know how you fell in love with history and who helped you fall in love with history.
Right. Off you go. This is it. This is the workshop we didn't advertise.
I reckon you could probably stay talking for quite a while. Can everybody hear me okay, by the way? Yep, groovy. Okay, fantastic. All right. Hold on to that one.
Order.
Because, hold on to that, and because we're going to come back to that. But right now we're going to talk a little bit about how history has changed over the last couple of decades and what we can do to give the past the best possible future. So we're going to talk about how it's changed and what's required to keep it changing so that we can keep evolving it. One of the things that I most love about history is that it's a broad church that can accommodate lots of passions and approaches and platforms and perspectives. And I think it's always, it's up to us to keep pushing the boundaries so that it can meet us in our moment, the moments of our changing society. So that's something that we've all got to do together. So we're just going to have a bit of a chinwag about some of the ways. What do you reckon, Keith? Some of the most important ways? I mean, you've been around a bit longer than me, so you've seen...
Only twice as long.
You've seen history change heaps, like how it was taught in the universities, how it's done in radios and TV.
Yeah, it's one of the things we naturally had a bit of a chat beforehand, and one of the things we both hit on was the idea of, it's got a better name than it, but I call it bottom-up history. What's the proper name?
History from below.
Oh, thank you.
So we can thank E.P. Thompson for that in the 1960s. So it kind of marks the idea of
tell us a bit more about that.
Well, it's not just the big name. So we have Joseph Carlyle, the Scottish historian of the 19th century, and he said history is really just the biography of great men. And for a long time, there was a little bit of pushback, but people basically did believe that. And then when they started to write about women, they only wrote about so-called great women, so princesses, queens, etc., etc. And it really did take that Marxist intervention to sort of say, well, what about all the people who we don't know about, who are also part of history? If we looked at the past through the lens of these versions of history, there would not be many people there. No. And there'd be a whole lot of anonymous people. So ever since then, history has really had to develop new techniques to deal with fragmentary archives and to ask those questions of, and this is one of my passions, how do you write the stories? How do you represent people for who didn't have the education, the influence, the economics to leave much of an archival trace? How do we bring them back and make them part of our stories? Because they really matter. Well, so over that time, it went from women, then it went to homosexual stories, all the stories in the margins.
What about the workers?
That's it, the workers. Well, they were the starting point.
Yeah.
And now we've been thinking a lot about First Nations stories. Yep. And thinking about the politics and the problems of those.
We're really, when we will get to what next, and that's part of what's next. We're just getting warmed up. But for me, that version of history, again, a sort of personal background on this. My grandfather was on the beach on April 25th, 1915 at Gallipoli, but he didn't tell me anything about it. He died when I was 12, but there was a rule at home for my mum, you don't ask questions. And there was, therefore, I was included in that rule. You don't ask Grandpa any questions. But I knew he was a private, and he lasted 3 weeks, and he got shrapnel up Shrapnel Gully. But that interested me personally. And then along came a fella that some of you would have been taught by, or you'll know I've called Bill Gamage. Hey, the great Bill Gamage, he started doing the blindingly obvious today. He started reading the diaries of the soldiers. He got into the trenches with them. And so that was just a revelation for me, because you're right, in the 50s when I was learning it at school and so on, it was very king and queen and John Morphetty,
Australian history as a discipline within our universities really only started in the 1960s. It was I imagine there's quite a few people here who would have only done Australian history as kind of week 12 of a British history course. Is that right? Would there be many people like that?
And then when we did do it, it was all rum, rebellion and wool, and that was over there.
Yeah, right. So not really relevant to the South Australian story.
In fact, when we get to it, I think we're still suffering from that problem, and the teachers amongst us will be able to tell us the bad news that it's really hard to get South Australia into the curriculum.
And into the national narrative.
Well, so as a result, therefore, into the national narratives.
That's one of my passions. One of the things I'd like to do is see the South Australian story be better positioned, better understood, better appreciated for its significances.
You mentioned women, for instance. I mean, we're sort of getting onto it now. We have got a couple of statues up, but somebody like Augusta Zaddo. Now, do you know Augusta Zaddo?
No.
Anybody here know Augusta Zaddo?
Hey, Keith,
fantastic.
Tell us about Augusta Zaddo.
No, I'll get someone else to tell it. It's Liz. Exactly, the first inspector of factories in South Australia, which meant she was right at the front end of workers' rights. And so, but there's not much about her, is there?
Yeah.
And yet she's a towering figure, really, in terms of the change. Now, sure, Kingston gets a lot of the benefit, and he gets a statue in Victoria Square because he was a Labor Premier and pro-workers' rights.
Also, the
Mary Lee, of course.
Right. But the question...
Catherine Helen Spence.
It kind of raises that question of, do we want statues? How are we going to commemorate people now? Statues are really a late 19th century memory device, and they often serve a whole lot of other political functions that are more about the people who are erecting those statues than the actual historical moment itself. So what do we want now?
That's a good question for later, but I was thinking about... I'm just following the plot you gave me. But interestingly, in South Australia, some of ours were, sure, they were, the council fathers or the parliamentary fathers, and they were all male, but there was a bit of good grassroots going on. For instance, this week is the anniversary of the Scottish poet.
Robbie Burns.
Sorry?
Robbie Burns?
Yeah, Robbie Burns, outside the State Library. And he was put up by the Caledonian Society. Right, so that was them doing it. Now, it was probably the great men of the Caledonian Society, but at least it was community. And even some of the others were like that. Stuart he was the same thing. He was the Caledonian Society too, wasn't he? But so there was a bit of kind of community involvement rather than it being foisted upon us from above. Light, of course, is just a great story. It's always wonderful to tell people, because, you know, they look at Colonel Light up there and there he is. Oh, that gets us onto furphies and myths. And one of the great furphies and myths is suddenly, once it's in print, it just runs. Suddenly people are saying in print that that's where he stood and said, "This is a site for a city."
Yeah.
Well, that was the bloke over in Utah or Salt Lake City, wasn't it? Wasn't here. But however, he didn't do that because his statue wasn't even there to begin with. He was in his second monument, because the first one melted away in Light Square.
Yeah.
His next one, and it took years to get it going by people's raising money. He ended up just between the GPO and the Treasury building at the top of northern end of Victoria Square, 1906. Problem is, 1906 is pre-lorries and cars, and it's pre-trams, 1909. So frankly, he was getting in the way. And it's a bit awkward, isn't it? Saying, well, what are we going to do with him? And it took until 1936, the centenary year, when the Pioneers Association, they organised the centenary lookout up on Montefiore Hill. And then one architect had the great idea, why don't we move him up there? And we did, just in time to commemorate his death in 1839. We got him up there in 1938. So even a story like that, poor old Colonel Light, there are mixed stories behind it, which leads to something either now or later, doesn't it? How do you interpret these things?
Mm-hmm. And what does it mean to commemorate? Why do we decide as a society about what we commemorate? And I guess, you know, when we think about those questions, we sort of start to turn towards statue wars and the Black Lives Matters events that happened throughout 2020, and also really that has been an issue that has been percolating for so much longer.
You've got a terrific story. For instance, we just saw the tip of the story that there was a famous person involved in slavery, like directly involved. What city?
So in Bristol, the slave owner Edward Colston, his statue had been there because he was also considered a sort of founding father, because his money was used to build so much of Bristol, and including boys' homes and education facilities, etc., etc. But many of the descendants of slaves who had lived there for several generations had been talking to the council for 40, 50, 60 years saying, it's offensive, pull it down, please take it down, we're sick of it, it's upsetting, it's distressing, etc., etc. And their complaints were just falling on deaf ears. And so when that spark was lit about Black Lives Matter, it was the opportunity. And so when we saw that statue being pulled down, beheaded, dragged to the Bristol Sea and cast into the very water that Colston had once plied his human trade, we're really seeing 60 years of deafness, of selective deafness and frustration selective deafness on behalf of the council. And to me, that's a really important snapshot of where we are as a society, that we are learning to listen to one another and we are processing that frustration. You know, like my instinct is there's never been, sorry if I'm invoking Malcolm Turnbull here for a second, but I don't think there's ever been a more exciting time to be doing history, because we really have so many different perspectives, so many different publics, so many different platforms, and they make it really, really rich. It means that those frustrations that were previously ignored or silenced or denied are being heard, and that's going to make a better society for all of us.
So back to the statue issue, as in some might go, will any arrive now? Are we past the statue age?
Yeah. Well, there's been a kind of big debate about what they call counter-memorialisation. So you might keep the statue, but you might wrap around it other forms of counter-memorialisation. So a classic example is in Western Australia, where there was a sort of 1870s statue that was done to remember the lives of a number of white settlers who had been speared by natives on one of their expeditions. And in the 1980s, Bruce Gates, the amazing historian who's also dealt with war and oral histories, he worked with Noongar community to do the counter story. that talked back to that and said, actually, there's problems with this, that those white settlers were involved in skirmishes themselves, that these were the other things that happened. And so when you go and look at that statue now, you're also engaging with these other things. And so the voices, the counter perspectives can be heard. So there's a challenge in that one too, Keith. It's like, do we do statues to respond to the statues and then counter statues? And after a while, we might not be able to walk around our public spheres because they're so full of so many commentaries. But it does show that there's been, in fact, some very careful thinking about this going on since the 1980s. It's just, is there enough appetite to do this more generally across a range of different statues?
On Batman's statue in Melbourne,
Yes.
they put an extra line in to explain more of what was going on there.
Yeah.
Can you help us with that? For the...
Yeah, so, I'm sorry, what's your name? Jeannie. Jeannie just mentioned that in Melbourne, the John Batman statue, which is another, he was, I'm not sure how many people know, but John Batman considers himself to be one of the founders of Melbourne. He came across from Tasmania and he made a treaty called the Batman Treaty with the Kulin Nation, where they signed away all their land for mirrors and blankets, you know, pretty much that stereotype. And that treaty was then sent to the governor and denied because, of course, you can't have a treaty if you've got terra nullius. But Batman was a very contentious figure, not a very likeable figure, face torn away with syphilis and pretty unlikable person. But he had been venerated as a foundation father because that had been so much of the ways that we've done our pioneer history. And so a counter memorialisation has gone there that tells a little bit more and a little bit more. And so I think this is really interesting. We are becoming so much more informed. You know, there's so much more general public awareness about things, and that is meaning that we're changing our stories. Pretty exciting.
It's also, I'm a visual artist. It's also people who use a lot of words talking about visual arts and old skills. Okay, and we're all commiserating about the loss of old skills.
Yes.
But if we don't engage with the sculptors and the people that have those skills, they will be lost too. So it's not just for wordy people to be telling the visual artists who created those works. I mean, how do we know that if there is a protest within that sculpture somewhere? We don't. We only know that a sculptor was commissioned to make that work.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think we do know some of the political motivations behind the 19th century statues, but I really love what you're saying about artisan trades being threatened species, threatened practices that we need to care for very much. And that's something my colleagues at the History Trust and I have been talking about quite a lot, is how do we preserve those artisan trades? And in fact, in Ballarat, there's a new museum that's been formed that's focusing precisely on that, because I think we recognise that as being incredibly important.
I reckon we'd call ours the Tom Price Award, or the Tom Price Academy, because Tom Price was the stonemason who worked on the columns of Parliament House, having come out here because he had stonemason's disease. So then it was a slightly better climate for him, but he became Premier. It's just a wonderful, it's a sort of wonderful South Australian story too, because I think that one of the things about our origins was that this was a land of opportunity, not just to make a big quid, which some people did very well, but also to actually be able to to get on with what you wanted to do without the trammels of all of the sort of class society of the 1830s in England. So it sort of goes back to that lovely idea that in Australia there was more freedom of movement. There was a chance for a stonemason to get involved in politics and go on. Whereas in the 1830s, while there was a big reform movement, which is another interesting story, there weren't too many stonemasons in the House of Commons. In fact, there's a fantastic story that's a bit undone still, and I've brought one little section of it. There's a 3-volume work called Behind the Streets of Adelaide. Some of you might have been lucky enough to persuade your family to give it to you on an important birthday like I did. And Geoffrey Nicholas is a South Australian who, in fact, I had another look at the preface today, and he answered the question as to how he got involved. Why would he be interested in writing about more than 60 street names? In his case, he was actually a professor of physical education and health and all that jazz at Flinders, but he got interested in South Australiana and collecting old books. And then he starts thinking, who are all these people? And indeed, at the moment, it would be fair to say that 99% of us would be struggling to get past more than half a dozen of them and string a sentence together. Would that be fair? Like Curry. Who was Curry? Who was Hindley? Morfitt? Okay, he came here. We know a bit about him.
I don't think Curry ever came to the colony.
Exactly,
I think he
some
was
of them
one of the
didn't.
investors.
Quite so.
Yeah.
But this collection of this 10 years of research shows that, in fact, we pride ourselves in being a reformed society at the beginning, at the very least. And what he discovered, and I think it's true that he was the one who put it together, he found that nearly half of the people who were named in the streets of Adelaide were in the Reform Parliament of 1832.
Yeah.
When they actually probably saved England from revolution.
Right.
Because Corn Law Reform, electoral reform, get rid of the rotten boroughs where you could actually buy a seat, and only Clive Palmer tries that these days. And then what else? Abolition of slavery.
Well, that's right. And not just the abolition of slavery, also the decision to provide funding to previous slave owners. So the manumission of slaves at that precise time. So was it 200 million? 200 million to slave owners. And a lot of that money actually came into the settlement of South Australia, to the South Australian colony, one way or another.
Yeah, through Angus, Montefiore and so on.
Yep, that's right.
So the idea, it's interesting, isn't it? These things weave together, but there was this genuine reform movement in England at the time. People like Goodger, for instance. I mean, he was, as I described him in The Horrible History of Adelaide, he was a ratbag radical. I mean, he believed in women's suffrage in the 1830s. Took the POMs until the 1920s. There was this genuine sense for change and for not living in slums and for not living with this terribly structured society. And so the purer side was there, but there was also the capitalist side. It was a strange but quasi-successful move.
And what I love about that also is that these people were two things that were, to our eyes, entirely contradictory. So many of them were reformists, and yet they were also beneficiaries, many of them beneficiaries of that slave money. And that's who they were. And to me, that's so exciting because it invites us to think about what are the unbelievable contradictions in our characters that we can't even see, that other people might look to us in the future and see fault lines in our ethics.
And you can probably write about them and say they were but innocent recipients, or you can write about them and say, no, they were in it all the way. And so
what I love about history is to actually say, let's understand these people in all of their complexity, their reforming ideals, their good ambitions, but also their myopia, the way that they deliberately turned a blind eye to certain things that were too complicated or not even just part.
At least one of the principles of this state was there will be no slaves. I mean, it sounds screamingly obvious.
But actually, Keith.
Hello, here we go.
So the poorest labourers in South Australia were known as 2-shilling slaves. That's what they were, how they were mockingly derided by the labourers who made more money. So slavery was yet again in the kind of vernacular and the thinking. It was something to avoid. It was something that people didn't want to transport here, but it was still very much a part of people's lives and thinking.
So under the Wakefield scheme, we'll sell the land, we'll give you free passage, but we'll be very lousy pay at the other end.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you immediately came up with a male. And it's very hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
We fall into that trap.
Well, maybe we've got to have an Augusta Zaddo one as well, because I think you're right. You're absolutely right.
that only men stood for Parliament, only men were able to vote. The women were doing good things, but they didn't make the front page of the newspaper, which was one of the most easiest way for people to communicate those days. So, like Mary Colton, we don't know her, but she's up there and she should be venerated. There's a women artist that could be, just using the example. So I think we've got to be very cautious when you're talking about they, which you are, they were men, all of them. And they had opportunity of education.
So, you know, so many of the Scottish women who came to South Australia in particular had been given quite an extraordinary education. So Catherine Helen Spence might be our poster girl here. And they had terrific educative powers to insert themselves into these conversations, and they did, and they were influential in them.
And that's what I'm saying, they may have been in the background, but Helen Spence was one we know. There must be 1,000 others we don't know. So I just would like audience parents to think when you're saying they, the reflection is really male. That's what you're giving us.
I mean, this feels like it might be a nice time to invite our audience to turn to one another again and to talk about the South Australian stories that you think haven't been told, that need to be told, some element of South Australia that really matters to you that you think we should be talking about tonight. So can we invite you to turn to one another and have a chat about what you think matters in South Australian history? This is a People's Forum. It's your chance to tell us what you think really matters and what needs to be on the South Australian history agenda. What would you advocate for? Why does it matter? Yes?
So we talked a bit about statues and the naming of things. And who we name things after is fascinating, and also the order in which we name them. So, for example, while we've acknowledged the Victoria Square has another name, a Ghana name, we often see it with Victoria Square and then Tanganyika in brackets. Why do we not have Tanganyika first and Victoria Square in brackets? Because it was always that name. Flinders named things like Cape Catastrophe. They already had names. So while we are sad for the friends that he lost, and that's a story in itself, his heroic journey was erasing names of things. And a particular bugbear of mine in terms of a name that is used, Wakefield.
Yes.
Wakefield spent a period of time in Newgate prison because he kidnapped a minor. Why do we have anything in this state named after somebody that kidnapped a minor? Because there's a word that we have for people like that. And the word is pedophile.
Well, look, I actually studied Wakefield for my PhD, which was on abduction, which was the crime for which he was convicted. And
he did it twice.
He did it, that's right. The first
So he's got four.
He's a double abductor. The first time he got away with it and married the woman and married into a very successful family. And when she died, he basically tried it again, less successfully, with England's wealthiest heiress, and that he kind of narrowly avoided execution, just thanks to a legislative change. But people in Ireland were still being executed for that crime up until 1841. So, yes, I've actually wondered that quite a lot myself. You know, the letter for Sydney, I think, and sometimes I think we polish Wakefield up a little bit more than we should. We should see his feet of clay. No, I agree with you. But I love what you're saying there about priorities of language. And for those of you who have been to Ireland, I think you might notice that Irish is always put first, and then English, second to that.
Yeah, same in Wales.
Yes, yeah, right. Yeah.
If you ask a Kiwi where they come from these days, they will say Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're making slow inroads there, but I think we need to be more energetic with that. And that's partly a heritage question as much as a history question, isn't it? But I suspect it needs to go hand in hand with more Ghana. We all need to know more Ghana to be able to do, I mean, not to do that, but to advance it passionately and confidently as well. It's a great point. Did you have a question down here? A comment, sorry.
Yes, I'm Alison McKinnon.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
I'm Alison McKinnon. I'd like to make a point about the discussion about women's history. I mean, there has been a tremendous amount of women's history written in South Australia.
Yes.
There's been a very active cohort of women's historians.
Yeah.
And I mean, one of the problems, I guess, is that these things are not taught as much now as they were, for instance, in the 1980s and 90s. That history has generally been squashed in universities. There's been a huge push towards science, commerce and everything else, and the humanities have been very much sort of concertinaed into a small space. And it's not the lack of documenting women. We've got a lot of that in South Australia, but it's just the lack of courses. And I mean, you would know,
Absolutely.
Kiera, how difficult. We used to have women's studies, which included women's history. How do we get this all out into the public?
Yeah.
I think that's the point I'd like to make. Women were very active in South Australia and are well documented.
Yeah.
So somehow we need to get that out into the public sphere.
And I think, thanks Alison, I think that's a great point because it raises this question of the status of history in the universities. I think it'd be fair to say it's something of a threatened species these days. More and more universities are shrinking their history courses, where once upon a time history departments were often the flagship courses or disciplines in the humanities because they were so linked to national narrative storytelling. But I'm absolutely from that generation of women's history. I write women's history myself. And I would say that when you write women's history, you often have to write it differently because the sources that you're writing are differently. And so the other pressure on getting women's stories out into the general public sphere, I guess, is that what some of the most popular forms of Australian history that are sold from a publishing point of view tend to be those by the Peter Fitzsimons, the war histories, the male sports histories and things like that. And it takes a commitment from publishers like my publisher, Allen and Unwin, to say women's stories really matter and that's what we're going to do. And so it is about us also showing that there's an appetite and putting the pressure on publishers as well.
I think, this is not the answer, but one of the pluses is living in the digital age, Alison. I think you'll agree that we used to see the only way you could get to stuff was see an academic journal or a fairly specialist newspaper. We've got the potential now to bring those stories forward because in the digital age, it's available to everybody. Just go get the app, and History Trust is doing good work, but I'm sure that the History Trust people here will tell us that they could double their budget and just spend time on that, on us getting this information, that information, plus a whole lot of other good South Australian stuff, just getting it out there and making it available. You can do it, but it costs time and money.
And there's a question there too, I think, about what is the relationship between the public sphere as brick and mortar spaces that we walk around in and the digital sphere as spaces that we travel through in different ways. Do they counter each other out? If we solve things in the digital space, does it mean that they can stay the same? Other questions? Wonderful.
Keith and Kiera, the special Ks might be a nice name for you two.
It's a deal.
I think if we're waiting for universities to progress the study of history, I think we've left it too late.
We're doomed.
we've talked about people developing passion for history by things that happened to them when they were young. And that means we need to be working on the schools.
Absolutely.
As someone heavily involved in schools for 40 years, I know that that's where the key is. You need passionate teachers, and there are lots and lots of them there. On a positive note, we do have a national curriculum that makes history compulsory. That's one of the important things that needs to happen. But I think, as I said, if we're leaving it to the universities, we're leaving it far too late. As Keith said, it's about resources, and I know that the History Trust is producing resources for schools in the mediums that schools are using now and that students are using. That's where we need to put the resources. Just on a personal note, it was 2 history teachers who really ignited my passion. One, a gentleman called Brian Mesner, a 20-stone opera singer at Adelaide High, who was also the sports master. And he had a passion for ancient history, and in particular the stories of the ancient Roman emperors. And he loved every bit of their stories, including the feasting and the drinking and gambling. The other was a gentleman, the late John Wood, passionate hockey player, which was my sport, but also passionate historian, very much 20th century history, so not all the old stuff that we used to learn about. And also the professional historian of the Port Adelaide Football Club until his untimely death. I also got into history because I had the good fortune in the early 1960s, when my father was studying for a PhD in Canberra, of travelling around the Riverina district, where he was interviewing old men from the 1880s and 1890s who were born then, talking about their selection stories. And I also had the good fortune to sleep in the back of a 1930 Dodge on the banks of the river.
We needed someone else to go out and talk to the women, because the women pioneers have a different perspective on all of that. And we're still dry on that. We've still got a long way to go.
We're in the slipstream of 2036, the bicentenary of colonisation. And based on what happened in the lead up to 1936, I would suggest that it's not too early for people to start thinking about using that emerging opportunity and point in time as a potential mobiliser of resources for looking at South Australian history. Certainly associated with the centenary, there was a considerable amount of work undertaken, committees were formed, projects were established, and quite a substantial body of material was produced. So that's one possible positive future potential. And in terms of that history, just one thought I would have is an area where I think there isn't a history really for South Australia is economic history. And also a history that puts South Australia in both the national context and indeed the international context. We don't have a history of South Australia in the context of the British Empire and then the transition to the US period of dominance, nor indeed, and certainly by 2036, the emerging world with the greater influence of China. So there's a whole bunch of histories that we simply don't have, and perhaps by 2036, we may have had some of that put together.
It gives us a target, doesn't it? Because people love anniversaries, including governments. But there is a sideline to that 1936 one. When they formed the committee, the Centenary Committee for 1936, there was just one small omission, and that was women. They weren't any on it. So what did the women do? They said, oi! And so there was a Centenary Women's Committee formed, and that's why we have the Pioneer Women's Garden, which was opened in 1941, but they'd been working from that centenary on. And they had that brilliant idea of, at exactly the same time, opening the Royal Flying Doctor Service base in Alice Springs. And so that was about the pioneer women of today, or in their time, and the pioneer women that they were celebrating. So we didn't get it right then. We'd better get it right next time. Jubilee 150 did some good things. I think we'd have to say that we were lucky that we were in an era when we had an historian for a premier in John Bannon, and it really got wheels. And some of the things we take for granted for now, including the great museums of the History Trust, wouldn't be there without Jubilee 150. By now, there wouldn't be a precinct. The Port Adelaide State Heritage Area wouldn't have been saved, I suspect. We certainly wouldn't have saved the old bond store that is now the Maritime Museum and so on. Liz?
There were 1,300 school projects in 1986. We probably produced about 10 resource books, including Aboriginal Children Speak, as part of that series. And I like to think that the impact of that year on the understanding of young people was really quite profound. But as we've been speaking, it's been lost in this century. And that is what we have to remedy.
The SA 175, sadly, with another Labor government, they just weren't interested.
Didn't exist.
But good things were done by the History Trust. I still use Bound for South Australia, which was based on all of the ships coming out and all of the people, including not just the captains and the great people, but the diaries of some of the women on board, particularly. They are now available on the web, which takes us back to the digital age. It was the beginning of the digital age, really, and it was a great work by the History Trust. So SA 175, other people did something, but sadly the government just about ignored it. In fact, the Governor of South Australia got a couple of us involved to do a big concert stroke audio-visual presentation because the government didn't. So they invited 2,000 people in for nothing and made it sure it was community-wide because the governor of the day was very keen on it.
Now, it'd be very tempting to go into a discussion about government appetite for history. And I understand there's a woman up here who has a question. I just wanted to quickly touch base on your comments before. I know that a member of our trustee one of our trustees is very interested in these questions, and has Alan Reid has something in the History Festival program, I think in the last week of the History Festival, for you to look at, and so to bring that question to. And I would like to suggest that this is actually an issue of enormous sensitivity to First Nation people. It's not a celebration to them, and perhaps the idea of turning the language around in place might be something that we look to as a way of acknowledging that. So I just wanted to put those things in, and I know you've been waiting a long time up there.
Yeah, I think my hand was the first one up. The question was originally what do we think is important in South Australian history, and I'd like to emphasise the living heritage traditions of the City of Adelaide, one most importantly that dates back to 1858 when Rakes Curry, who was also a banker who helped with a guarantee fund for South Australia, George Palmer, Jacob Montefiore, two of the commissioners, and Alexander Elder, gifted an ornamental solid silver bowl to be used by the Mayor and the members of the Council of the City of Adelaide to drink an Australian wine to the memory of Lieutenant Colonel Light, the first Surveyor General of South Australia. And they made it easy for us. They engraved the toast in the solid silver bowl, and that ceremony hasn't been held for several years. In fact, in 2021, the Lord Mayor announced that there would be no toast to Colonel Light at the function that was held, and the day was saved by our host, Keith Conlon, who he just held a toast anyway. Thank you very much. And
Bill's a personal mate of mine. I wasn't going to let that pass.
Yeah, so the day was saved by Keith, and everyone was in shock because they had attended to toast Colonel Light and were being told by the Lord Mayor that there was to be no toast. But in fact, that ceremony wasn't a proper light ceremony in the way that the donors had intended, because the bowl had been turned into a sterile trophy locked in a glass case such that the wine could not be poured from it for the toast. And it wasn't a toast by the councillors. They didn't bother attending because it wasn't in a council meeting as the donors had asked. And so the only ones there were the mayor and the MC. And this year it was privatised so that even people like me were not permitted to enter, and I haven't even been allowed to get a copy of the guest speaker's statement, and I'm told it won't be available until the citations are done in July.
Well, you're it.
Yeah.
You were it.
That was me. And as you can see, Kelly, I'm quite busy and I'd like to get my citations in order before I publish that transcript. So I'm very much looking forward to, it was a great honour to be able to be invited to do the commemorative toast for Colonel Light this year in the council, and that will be published in due course, probably when I'm through the other side of the History Festival. So no one has been denied anything. It's just a little bit of time.
So the joys of the digital age will be we can get it on the History Trust site sometime soon.
Yeah, that's right. I was just finishing my book, copy edits for my book on Sunday. So there's a bit of backlog, but it will happen, and that will be publicly available. But it's wonderful that there's such passion and custodianship about these commemorative moments.
Professor Mackay here from UniSA. Apart from the interesting approach to water management in this state, which could do with a bit more research, the other thing I would like, if you're looking for a topic, is to look at the history of gardening in South Australia, particularly the cultivation of roses and other plants, because I did a bit of work on this for the Irish Society magazine. And South Australia had some of the best hybridisers of some plants up until the period of about 1850, and places like Balfour's and Harris Scarf sold irises and roses in their main store. So I think it was very hard to get any information about Balfour's. I tried, but I got the figures from the various newspapers and trove in the State Library, including the catalogues that Harris Scarf published. And these were relatively expensive plants, yet the sales were enormous. Yeah. And these were the days before biosecurity between the states too, so there was a lot of transfers between the states. Yeah. But I do think that's worthy of some further work.
Yeah. Garden tourism is a I think the Premier is interested in tourism. I just get that hint that he's interested in tourism. And so it's a good angle. Let's face it, it works around the world. So tying it in with the research side and getting that right, and then offering the chance for people to see what was and what is a great idea.
Yeah, and there's been some fantastic garden history done by Katie Holmes and Latrobe, and Paul Fox wrote a fantastic thing about the colonial garden. So it could be quite interesting to map those histories into other interstate. And that's
one of my mate.
Yeah.
One of the wonderful things about the dig, which was done just recently because the brewery's being sold and it's got down to the bare earth, was that when we expected and had provisionally listed the house, because we knew it was under there, but we didn't know how much was under there. But what we didn't know, and Guadalupe, the fantastic archaeologist who was working on it, she was just abuzz because she discovered Colonel Light's and Maria Gandy's Mediterranean garden outside the house. And I'm saying to her, well, you sure that's not a bit later? She says, hey, it's got the same thumb marks. One of Maria's brothers actually fired the bricks and stuck his thumb in them, so we know that it was his work. And they were doing the lining of a circular garden, which says Mediterranean, not Victorian. So we've got a story that goes back to 1839.
And that's a beautiful story too, Keith, because when Light was too sick, when he resigned from his private consultancy business, he retreated to the cottage, and as well as water painting, doing his watercolours, he spent a lot of time in his garden. Yep. So that garden is actually quite special place. Oh, question up the back. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Clint. I haven't been part of history too much other than having a birth certificate. But my question is to the pair of you, what is your view on the current state government's work in the history space?
Do you want me to go first? I think I should go first and then leave it to you, Keith.
And I'll just weep for a little bit.
Look, I think that it's an exciting state government. They mean business. They want to keep their promises, and they're working hard to do that for the South Australian people, which means that they're going to probably be a two-term government, I suspect. And so we need to be in a good relationship with them, and that's a very, very important thing to do. I have had some concerns with the way that heritage and history have sometimes been seen as a versus or an either or to history and heritage. Whereas I think what we need to do as history lovers, people who care about history, is make the case that history is part of what keeps us healthy. History is a binding agent. It's a form of meaning making. It gives us a sense of pride and belonging and passion, things that make us healthy as a people. So I would like to see us together as shared advocates playing a role in saying, hey, it doesn't have to be history versus health, heritage versus hospitals. We can work together to make this state as healthy and happy as possible. On the other side, I would say, I thought what they did with the First Nation voice and the way that they opened up Parliament and made that a public event with these massive televisions so that we could see inside the political system and watch reform happening. I thought that was so sensitive and alive to the importance of history that I think we have an in. We have an in if we can talk about the importance of South Australia's history of reform. But I think we need to work together on this one.
I was counselled by my daughter before I came here tonight. She said, take the tablets, Dad.
And have you?
And I have. I took the tablets a long time ago.
Put them in your pocket.
Yeah, keep a couple to spare. But in fact, while there is a kind of complete disconnect with what happened with the hospital and now with another bit of the parklands for the barracks, I'm actually confident that we're about to go forward in history and heritage because there's years of work has been going on behind the scenes on both the history side and on the heritage side. And I think we're going to come out the other side, and it may be weirdly partly because they've got to make up some ground. But there is genuine support on the education side and on the heritage minister side. And I think we've clearly, with a presidential style government, you have to get Peter Malinauskas on side. We've got to work on that. But there is quite encouraging noise coming out, and it may only be days or weeks away that we will hear that some of the heritage reform, which will hold the built form in better state, is about to happen. It's been sidelined and all sorts of historical reasons for it, but the fact is I think we're about to see some progress. And I'm hoping, and so is the History Trust and other people, we're hoping that there are other things going to happen on the history side as well. So there's not a lot of point in chucking rocks at them, and so I'm not going to. But I, in fact, will be in the phalanx of people who will be, I hope, firmly saying, you've got to get on with this, because history is important for reasons beautifully espoused by Kiera. Heritage is important environmentally and economically and in terms of our well-being. We've got good arguments. We've just got to get the ears.
And we've got to make those arguments, all of us, in our different ways, whether it's with our children, with the passion that we bring in the classrooms, in the digital work that we do, in the writing that we do, in the communicating that we do. It's up to us to bring that passion to those conversations.
And I think the Adelaide Parklands Association is a very good advocate for the parklands and does a lot of good work. Currently, they're advertising for go to the next community meeting where the Premier is going to be and talk to him about it. They don't say it, but I think the notion would be, again, if you chuck rocks, what you tend to get is a reaction, don't you? You know, bugger off. If you try to bring them on board with it and understand the passion of all of you in this room, then we've got a better chance. So I would advocate for strong and very, very well argued points to be made to government, but don't try and, you know, just don't go down the totally negative track because it doesn't work.
And I really like what you said about the Malinowskis government being quite a presidential government. I think that they're very serious. I was there in the public gallery at the reading of the bill for the First Nations voice to Parliament, and he said very clearly, the eyes of the nation are upon us. And that's what I think that Malinowskis wants to do, wants to have the eyes of the nation on South Australia. So if we can use that.
We can give him a good story in history and heritage to take to the nation. Yeah.
Gradient of a second goal. Do you think there are any lessons of South Australian history? And if you do believe there are any lessons, I'd love to hear what they might be.
Oh, thanks. In my silly history, the horrible history of Adelaide, I said, because it's all fifth columnist stuff, it's all about getting some good history into them. One of the things that I mentioned is that we actually pride ourselves on being a great reform state begun by a great group of reformers, but we in fact we have bursts of reform and then long periods of conservative nothingness. And so one of the lessons for us, I think, is that the battle ain't never over. You've got to take the opportunities all the time. You've got to work towards getting a bit of a chink in the armour, because there is a natural resistance, which I find difficult to understand, but there seems to be a natural resistance to getting into history and heritage. We've got to take them there.
And I'm really interested in early moments of settlement, of European settlement. I've studied it in the Sydney context and the Melbourne context, and I've sort of got this working theory that the seeds or the tropes get sown then and they repeat again and again and again.
What's an example of that?
Well, in Sydney there's a kind of a very belligerent and quite corrupt government culture where no one really expects the government to be about much else but their own self-interest, I think. And it's very much part of that free settler society. It's kind of built into it. And what I find interesting about the South Australian story, and I've sort of got it in the back of my mind that it might be my next book, writing about sort of 36 to 56, something around that time period. And I'm really interested in how badly the colony treated Colonel Light in the years before his death. One of the words that I was going over the archives in preparation for that talk I recently gave in the council last Thursday, and the word pernicious cabal came up. And I thought, that is such a powerful way of describing a group of people who were working so deliberately against something that was in their own best interests, against somebody.
It's interesting because there are a couple of cabals working.
Yes.
You know, 2 or 3 examples of that. For instance, the great naming day in May of 1837. Governor Hindmarsh, who was one of the cabals, he turns up and he's got a whole lot of old admirals in his pocket. We would never have heard of them then, and we certainly wouldn't have heard of them today. Light and his mates turn up and they've got the names of the reformers and they win the day. But it was a fight. You're right. The fight for the site was still going on 2 years later. Hindmarsh is still lagging with it.
Right.
So, and then, of course, there was the very good Reverend Howard, who wouldn't turn up on his deathbed because he was living in sin.
So it feels to me that when Adelaide is at its best, it is generous, open-minded, receptive. But when it's not at its best, some of these qualities come out. There's pernicious cabal. And there's a real lesson, I think,
it's
for
the
us
title. It's
to
definitely
look
the title.
at that shadow side of ourselves and own it sometimes and do better.
I'm not
if you know better, you can do better.
I'm not quite sure where the advertiser's going to lie on this one.
Well, I think...
What? Pernicious cabal?
Never seen one of them before.
No.
But how do we be our best selves? We have to be that if we're going to move together. And as much as we might love studying awful people behaving badly, I think we'd prefer not to go down in history as that ourselves. We'd like to be remembered for the contributions that we do make. And could there not be a person who has made a more wonderful, joyful and generous contribution to South Australian history than Keith? So big round of applause.
Thank you. I'm very, very honoured by being nobbled the way I have tonight, but it is lovely, and it's also fantastic. For most of you, I'm sure, it may be the first time that you've heard our new history advocate in full flight. Kiera Lindsey, it's wonderful to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to you both. You have asked and had the questions answered, and hopefully you've had a great night here talking about history and heritage. As you know, Keith has stepped out of the role as chair of the Heritage Council. He's taking a little bit more of a back seat, but I suspect he may be a little bit of a backseat driver on this front and continue in roles that we hope he does, because it's always great to have Keith Conlon's voice in this. I would love to just take a moment to thank him for all that he has done, and I hope you'll join me in thanking him and hoping that we'll still hear his voice for many years to come.
Yeah.
And they're not quite exchanging the gauntlet, but I guess maybe join me in wishing Kiera Lindsey good luck in her role as our inaugural history advocate here in South Australia. And let's wish her the best of luck as she continues in that role. And keep your applause going as I say thank you for joining us here at Postcards from the Edge. Enjoy your History Festival month. Please thank Keith Conlon, Kiera Lindsey and the whole History Trust of South Australia for bringing this on for us.
Thank you.